Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of history where time moves slowly and the weight of centuries settles gently upon your shoulders. Take a deep breath now, allowing the air to fill your lungs completely before releasing it in a long, measured exhale. Feel your body beginning to settle into whatever comfortable place you have found for yourself tonight. Notice how your shoulders naturally drop away from your ears, how your arms grow heavy at your sides, how the tension of the day begins to ebb away like water receding from the shore. Oh, let your eyelids grow heavy as we prepare to journey back through the mists of time, stepping carefully along cobblestone streets that have been worn smooth by countless footsteps. The air around us carries the faint scent of wood smoke from hearth fires, mingled with the earthy aroma of herbs drying in apothecary shops. Candlelight flickers against stone walls, casting dancing shadows that seem to whisper stories of ages long past. Tonight, we walk in the footsteps of medieval physicians, those dedicated souls who pursued the healing arts in an age when knowledge was painstakingly copied by hand, when the movements of stars were thought to govern human health, and when becoming a doctor meant embarking upon a path so arduous and uncertain that many never reached its end. This is the story of why being a medieval physician was, quite frankly, a living nightmare of endless bureaucracy, ancient superstition, and relentless study that could consume an entire lifetime without ever reaching completion. Yet somehow, in the gentle telling of these long-forgotten struggles, we find the perfect remedy for restless minds seeking sleep. Rest assured that our journey tonight will be as soft as silk, as measured as the turning of manuscript pages, with no sudden sounds to startle you from your growing drowsiness, no graphic descriptions to disturb the peace that is settling over you like a warm blanket. Only the soft, steady rhythm of history unfolding, one careful word at a time. The path to becoming a physician in medieval times was not for the faint of heart, the empty of purse, or those lacking in extraordinary patience. Long before one could even dream of treating patients, years upon years of preparation lay ahead, like an endless road stretching into the misty distance, its destination obscured by the sheer magnitude of learning required. First came the mastery of Latin, for all learned discourse was conducted in the language of ancient Rome, a tongue that had become the universal key to knowledge throughout medieval Europe. Students would spend countless hours conjugating verbs and declining nouns, their young fingers growing stiff and ink-stained from gripping reed pens as they copied out passages from classical texts. The rhythm of Latin verse became the soundtrack of their days. Rosa, rosa, rose, rosam, rosa, rosa, rosarum, rosis, 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 hour after hour, day after day, month after month, until the cadences of Cicero and Virgil flowed as naturally as their native tongues. The grammar alone required years to master. Students memorized the works of Donatus and Priscian, learning to parse sentences with mathematical precision. They studied the subtle differences between subjunctive and indicative moods, the proper formation of the ablative absolute, the correct usage of gerunds and gerundives. Each grammatical rule had exceptions, and each exception had sub-exceptions, creating a labyrinth of linguistic complexity that challenged even the most devoted scholars. Beyond grammar lay rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking that would prove essential in defending medical diagnoses before skeptical colleagues and patients. Students studied the works of Quintilian and Cicero, learning to construct arguments using the classical techniques of invention, arrangement, and style. They practiced declamations on hypothetical cases, defending imaginary patients against charges of malingering or arguing for controversial treatments before mock tribunals of their peers. Logic formed the third pillar of the trivium, teaching students to recognize valid arguments and identify logical fallacies. They studied Aristotle's categories and Porphyry's isagoge, learning to construct proper syllogisms and avoid the trap of false reasoning. The ability to think clearly and argue systematically would prove invaluable when navigating the complex theoretical disputes that dominated medieval medical practice. The quadrivium presented even greater challenges. Arithmetic required not only basic calculation, but an understanding of number theory and its philosophical implications. Students learned that numbers possessed mystical properties that influenced everything from musical harmony to the movements of celestial bodies. They memorized the properties of perfect numbers, triangular numbers, and the sacred tetractys of the Pythagoreans. Geometry demanded visualization skills that challenged students accustomed to purely textual learning. They studied Euclid's elements, working through hundreds of proofs and constructions using only compass and straight edge. The geometric principles they learned would later prove essential for understanding the proportional relationships that governed humoral theory and astrological medicine. Astronomy was perhaps the most demanding subject of all, requiring students to master complex mathematical calculations while memorizing the positions and movements of countless celestial bodies. They learned to use astrolabes and armillary spheres, calculating the positions of planets with reference to the elaborate system of epicycles and deferents that explained their apparent motions. The connection between astronomy and medicine was considered fundamental, as planetary influences were thought to affect every aspect of human health. Music completed the quadrivium, though medieval music theory was far removed from modern practice. Students studied the mathematical ratios that produced harmonious intervals, learning how the same proportional relationships that governed musical consonants also appeared in medicine, architecture, and the movements of the heavens. They memorized the modes and their associated emotional effects, knowledge that would later inform their understanding of how different treatments might affect patients' temperaments. University tuition was astronomical, payable only by the wealthy or those fortunate enough to secure patronage from the church or nobility. The University of Paris, where many aspiring physicians studied, charged fees that could bankrupt entire families. A single year's tuition might equal the annual income of a prosperous merchant, while the additional costs of books, lodging, and materials could easily double the expense. Students lived in cramped quarters, sharing beds and meals in conditions that would horrify modern observers. 6 or 8 young men might occupy a single room, sleeping on straw mattresses that harbored fleas and other vermin. Their clothes grew threadbare as they devoted every spare coin to books and materials, and many survived on bread and ale for days at a time when funds ran low. The books themselves were fantastically expensive, as each one had to be copied by hand. A single medical textbook might cost as much as a horse, making it impossible for most students to own personal copies. Instead, they relied on shared volumes that circulated among groups of scholars, taking turns copying out essential passages by candlelight. The university libraries were carefully guarded treasures, their chained volumes available only during limited hours and under strict supervision. Many students dropped out after a year or two, unable to sustain the financial burden or overwhelmed by the sheer volume of material they were expected to master. Those who persevered often did so at great personal cost, sacrificing health, comfort, and social relationships in pursuit of their scholarly goals. Some spent decades as students, supporting themselves through teaching younger scholars or performing menial tasks for their professors. The dropout rate was particularly high among those seeking medical degrees, as the course of study was longer and more demanding than other disciplines. After completing the liberal arts, aspiring physicians faced additional years of study devoted specifically to medical theory. They memorized the complete works of Hippocrates and Galen. Learning to recite lengthy passages verbatim, they studied Arabic medical texts that had been translated into Latin, wrestling with concepts that had been filtered through multiple languages and cultural contexts. The examination system was designed to identify and eliminate all but the most dedicated students. Professors would pose questions that required not only factual knowledge, but the ability to synthesize information from multiple sources and defend complex theoretical positions. Students might be asked to explain the relationship between planetary movements and humoral fluctuations, or to diagnose a hypothetical patient based on astrological charts and urine samples. Those who persevered through their university years found themselves apprenticed to established doctors, beginning yet another phase of their seemingly endless education. The transition from academic study to practical application often came as a shock to young scholars who had spent years immersed in theoretical texts. Suddenly, they found themselves responsible for mixing medicines, preparing instruments, and assisting in procedures that could mean the difference between life and death for real patients. The apprentice's day began before dawn, when he would rise to prepare his master's instruments and organize the materials needed for the day's work. He learned to sharpen lancets with whetstones, ensuring that the blades were keen enough to make clean incisions without causing unnecessary pain. He polished uroscopy flasks until they gleamed like crystal, for any cloudiness might interfere with accurate diagnosis. He ground herbs with mortar and pestle, learning to recognize the subtle differences in texture and aroma that indicated proper preparation. Much of the apprentice's time was spent in the tedious but essential work of copying manuscripts by hand. Every recipe, every theoretical treatise, every case study had to be painstakingly transcribed letter by letter, word by word, line by line. The young man would spend hours hunched over a writing desk, his back aching and his eyes straining in the flickering candlelight. The scratch of pen on parchment became the constant soundtrack of his days, punctuated only by the distant tolling of church bells marking the slow passage of time. The preparation of writing materials was itself a complex process. Parchment had to be scraped smooth with sharp knives, removing any imperfections that might cause the pen to skip or blot. Inks were mixed from oak galls and iron filings, their consistency carefully adjusted to prevent either smearing or inadequate flow. Quill pens required constant attention, their tips frequently recut to maintain proper writing characteristics. The apprentice learned to maintain detailed inventories of his master's possessions, cataloging every instrument, every bottle of medicine, every dried herb in the collection. He memorized the properties of hundreds of different substances, learning which herbs were best harvested in spring versus autumn, which minerals required special storage conditions, which preparations lost their potency if exposed to light or moisture. Gradually, the apprentice was permitted to observe his master's consultations, standing silently in the corner while diagnoses were made and treatments prescribed. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated different types of illness, watching how experienced physicians examined urine samples, felt for pulse rhythms, and calculated astrological influences. He observed the delicate negotiations that often preceded treatment, as families bargained over fees and physicians assessed the likelihood of successful outcomes. The relationship between master and apprentice was complex, combining elements of teacher and student, employer and employee, father and son. The master physician held complete authority over his apprentice's training, determining when the young man was ready to advance to new responsibilities and when additional study was required. Some masters were patient and encouraging, taking genuine pleasure in passing on their knowledge to the next generation. Others were demanding and critical, believing that harsh treatment would forge stronger physicians. The apprenticeship period typically lasted 7 years, though exceptional students might complete their training sooner, while others required additional time. During these years, the apprentice gradually assumed greater responsibilities, progressing from basic preparation tasks to assisting with simple procedures to eventually conducting his own examinations under supervision. Even after completing years of university study and apprenticeship, the aspiring physician faced the daunting prospect of licensing, a process that could prove even more challenging than his formal education. This required approval from church authorities or town councils, bodies that viewed medical practice with deep suspicion and considerable skepticism about the motives and competence of those seeking to treat the sick. The church maintained that illness was often divine punishment for sin, and any attempt to circumvent God's will through medical intervention bordered on heresy. Physicians had to navigate these theological minefields with extraordinary care, demonstrating that their practice complemented rather than contradicted religious doctrine. They were required to swear oaths affirming their Christian faith and promising to refer patients to clergy for spiritual counseling when appropriate. The licensing examination itself was a grueling ordeal that could last for days or even weeks. Candidates were questioned exhaustively on classical texts, asked to diagnose hypothetical ailments, and required to demonstrate their knowledge of astrological influences on health. They had to recite lengthy passages from Galen and Hippocrates from memory, explain the complex relationships between the four humors, and show proficiency in reading urine charts and pulse rhythms. The examiners were typically established physicians who guarded their professional territories jealously and had little incentive to approve new competitors. They would pose trick questions designed to reveal gaps in the candidate's knowledge, challenge his interpretations of classical authorities, and test his ability to defend controversial positions under pressure. Many candidates failed multiple times before finally receiving approval, while others never succeeded despite years of additional study. The oral examination covered not only medical theory but also practical skills. Candidates might be presented with actual urine samples to analyze, asked to demonstrate proper bloodletting techniques, or required to compound complex medicines according to traditional recipes. Any error or hesitation could result in failure, sending the candidate back to months or years of additional preparation. Even successful candidates often received conditional licenses that restricted their practice in various ways. They might be forbidden from treating certain types of patients, prohibited from performing specific procedures, or required to work under the supervision of established physicians for additional periods. Full licensing was sometimes withheld until the new physician had demonstrated competence through successful treatment of a specified number of cases. The theoretical foundation of medieval medicine rested upon the ancient doctrine of the four humors, a system so intricate and contradictory that even learned physicians struggled to apply it consistently. This theory, inherited from Greek and Roman antiquity and elaborated by centuries of Islamic and Christian scholars, held that the human body contained four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors were thought to course through the body in delicate balance, their proportions determining not only physical health, but also temperament, behavior, and susceptibility to disease. Each humor possessed specific qualities that related it to the fundamental elements of the cosmos. Blood was hot and moist, sharing the qualities of air in the season of spring. Phlegm was cold and moist, corresponding to water in winter. Yellow bile was hot and dry, linked to fire and summer. Black bile was cold and dry, associated with earth and autumn. This elegant symmetry appealed to medieval minds that sought to understand the world through systematic classification and cosmic correspondence. The humors corresponded not only to the seasons, but to the stages of human life. Childhood was dominated by blood, making young people naturally warm, moist, and sanguine in temperament. Youth brought an increase in yellow bile, creating the hot, dry, choleric nature associated with ambition and anger. Maturity saw the rise of black bile, producing the cool, dry, melancholic disposition that favored contemplation and wisdom. Old age was characterized by phlegm, resulting in the cold, moist, phlegmatic temperament marked by sluggishness and passivity. The theory extended to encompass virtually every aspect of human experience. Different occupations were thought to predispose individuals to specific humoral imbalances. Scholars who spent long hours in sedentary study were prone to excess of black bile and melancholic conditions. Soldiers exposed to heat and exertion tended toward choleric disorders caused by too much yellow bile. Sailors, surrounded by cold moisture, often suffered from phlegmatic ailments. Even one's diet, exercise habits, and emotional state could influence humoral balance in complex and unpredictable ways. The physician's primary task was to diagnose which humors were out of balance and prescribe treatments to restore equilibrium. This required consulting elaborate charts that correlated symptoms with humoral imbalances, taking into account the patient's age, gender, occupation, and the current phase of the moon. A headache might indicate excess blood in a sanguine person, requiring bloodletting to drain the surplus. The same symptom in a melancholic individual might suggest too much black bile, calling for purging with bitter herbs to evacuate the corrupted humor. The diagnostic process was further complicated by the need to consider seasonal variations, astrological influences, and the patient's individual constitution. What might be normal humoral balance for one person could represent dangerous imbalance for another. A naturally choleric individual could tolerate higher levels of yellow bile than someone of phlegmatic temperament, while a melancholic person might benefit from treatments that would prove harmful to a sanguine patient. Dietary prescriptions formed a crucial component of humoral medicine, as foods were classified according to their inherent qualities and their effects on bodily balance. Hot, dry foods like ginger, pepper, and aged wine were prescribed for patients suffering from cold, moist conditions. Cool, moist foods like cucumber, lettuce, and fresh milk were recommended for those afflicted with hot, dry disorders. The permutations were virtually endless, and physicians carried detailed reference works listing the humoral properties of hundreds of different foods, spices, and beverages. The preparation and timing of meals were considered as important as their ingredients. Food cooked over oak coals was thought to possess different humoral properties than food cooked over pine logs. Meals consumed at different times of day would have varying effects on humoral balance, as the body's natural rhythms were believed to influence digestive processes. Even the emotional state of the cook could supposedly affect the humoral qualities of the finished dish. For a patient diagnosed with an excess of melancholic humor during the winter months, the physician might prescribe an elaborate dietary regimen designed to counteract the cold, dry qualities of black bile. The patient would be instructed to consume warm, moist foods such as chicken broth seasoned with saffron, honey cakes made with sweet wine, and tender young vegetables cooked until soft. Dark bread, aged cheese, and salted meat would be strictly forbidden, as these foods were thought to increase melancholic humor. The patient would be advised to avoid beans and lentils, which were believed to generate thick, dark humors that could worsen the condition. Cabbage and other members of the brassica family were prohibited, as were any foods that had been stored for more than a day. Fresh fruits were generally discouraged, except for sweet varieties like figs and dates that could counteract the bitter qualities associated with black bile. Exercise recommendations were equally specific and complex. Gentle movement in warm, sunny locations was prescribed to counteract the cold, sluggish nature of melancholic humor, while vigorous activity in cold, damp environments was strictly forbidden. The patient might be instructed to take daily walks in enclosed gardens where the air was warmed by reflected sunlight, or to engage in light calisthenics before a well-tended fire. So, even sexual activity was regulated according to humoral theory, with different recommendations for different temperaments and seasons. The naturally hot and moist sanguine individual might be encouraged to moderate sexual activity during the spring, when blood was naturally ascendant, while the cold and dry melancholic person might be advised to increase such activity during winter to counteract the dominance of black bile. The complexity of these prescriptions meant that physicians spent considerable time educating patients and their families about proper implementation of treatments. They would provide detailed written instructions about food preparation, explaining precisely how different cooking methods would affect humoral properties. Families were taught to monitor patients for signs of improvement or deterioration, adjusting treatments according to carefully prescribed protocols. The seasonal nature of humoral theory required physicians to modify their treatments throughout the year, constantly adjusting prescriptions to account for changing environmental conditions and their effects on bodily balance. What might be appropriate treatment during the hot, dry days of summer could prove dangerous during the cold, moist months of winter. Patients often required completely different therapeutic regimens as the seasons changed, creating an ongoing relationship between physician and patient that could last for years. Diagnosis in the medieval period was an elaborate ritual that combined careful observation with complex theoretical calculations, creating a process that could take hours or even days to complete properly. The physician would arrive at a patient's bedside carrying his leather satchel filled with the specialized tools of his trade. Uroscopy flasks for examining urine, charts for interpreting pulse rhythms, and astrological tables for calculating planetary influences on health and disease. The consultation would begin with an extensive interview designed to elicit information about the patient's lifestyle, habits, and recent activities. The physician would inquire about dietary patterns, sleeping habits, exercise routines, and emotional states, believing that any of these factors might provide crucial clues about the underlying cause of illness. He would ask about the patient's occupation, social relationships, and spiritual practices, as all of these were thought to influence humoral balance. The timing of symptom onset was considered particularly significant, as it could reveal important information about astrological influences on the disease process. The physician would carefully note whether symptoms had begun during the day or night, on which day of the week, and during which phase of the moon. He would calculate the positions of the planets at the time of illness onset, looking for unfavorable conjunctions or aspects that might explain the patient's condition. Uroscopy, the examination of urine, was considered one of the most reliable and informative diagnostic techniques available to medieval physicians. This practice was based on the belief that urine provided a direct window into the body's internal processes, reflecting the balance or imbalance of the four humors with remarkable precision. Physicians carried elaborate diagnostic wheels showing 20 or more different colors and consistencies of urine, each corresponding to specific ailments and humoral disturbances. The urine would be collected in a specially designed flask called a matula, a clear glass vessel with a distinctive bulbous shape that allowed for optimal observation of the sample's characteristics. The timing of collection was crucial, with the first morning urine generally preferred for its concentrated properties, though samples might be taken at different times of day to track changes in the patient's condition. The examination process was painstakingly thorough. The physician would hold the medulla up to natural light, rotating it slowly to observe the urine from different angles. He would note the overall color, ranging from pale yellow to deep amber to reddish brown, comparing what he saw to the gradations shown on his diagnostic wheel. The clarity or cloudiness of the sample was equally important, as was the presence of any sediment or unusual particles. Clear, pale urine indicated a dominance of phlegmatic humor, suggesting cold, moist conditions that might require warming treatments. Dark, thick urine pointed to an excess of melancholic humor, indicating hot, dry imbalances that would benefit from cooling, moistening therapies. Reddish urine suggested inflammation or an excess of blood, while cloudy samples might indicate kidney disease or corruption of the humoral balance. The physician would examine the urine for foam, bubbles, or unusual odors, each of which provided additional diagnostic information. Sweet-smelling urine might indicate certain types of fever, while foul odors could suggest internal corruption or putrefaction. The presence of blood or other unusual substances would be carefully noted and interpreted according to established theoretical frameworks. Some physicians would even taste small amounts of urine, as sweetness, bitterness, or saltiness could provide valuable clues about the patient's condition. Sweet urine might indicate diabetes or certain types of fever, while bitter urine could suggest liver disorders or an excess of yellow bile. This practice, while repugnant by modern standards, was considered a normal and necessary part of thorough diagnostic evaluation. The examination would often be repeated multiple times throughout the day, as the humors were thought to fluctuate according to natural rhythms influenced by planetary movements and other cosmic forces. The physician might collect samples at dawn, midday, and sunset, comparing the results to track changes in the patient's condition and assess the effectiveness of prescribed treatments. Pulse reading represented another crucial component of medieval diagnosis, though the techniques employed bore little resemblance to modern practice. The physician would place his fingers on various points of the patient's body while consulting astrological charts and theoretical treatises that correlated pulse characteristics with humoral imbalances and planetary influences. The pulse was thought to vary not only with illness, but with the positions of the planets, the phase of the moon, and the patient's astrological constitution. A rapid pulse during a full moon might indicate one type of condition, while the same pulse rate during a new moon could suggest something entirely different. The physician would count pulse beats while reciting familiar Latin prayers, using the well-known rhythms of religious texts to measure time and an age before accurate timepieces were widely available. Different pulse points were thought to provide information about different organ systems and humoral balances. The pulse at the wrist might reveal conditions affecting the heart and blood, while pulses at the temples could indicate problems with the brain or head. Some physicians claimed to be able to detect pulses at dozens of different locations on the body, each providing unique insights into the patient's overall health status. The quality of the pulse was considered as important as its rate. A strong, regular pulse suggested good humoral balance and favorable prognosis, while weak or irregular rhythms indicated serious imbalances that might prove difficult to correct. The physician would note whether the pulse felt hot or cold, hard or soft, thick or thin, interpreting these characteristics according to complex theoretical frameworks that had been developed over centuries of medical practice. Before prescribing any treatment, the conscientious physician would cast a complete horoscope for the patient, calculating the positions of the planets at the time of birth and at the onset of illness. This astrological analysis was considered essential for understanding the cosmic influences that had predisposed the individual to disease and for determining the most auspicious times for therapeutic intervention. The horoscope construction required considerable mathematical skill and access to astronomical tables that were both expensive and difficult to obtain. The physician would spend hours with his astrolabe and calculation sheets determining the exact positions of the sun, moon, and 5 known planets within the 12 houses of the zodiac. Each planetary position had to be calculated with reference to the complex system of epicycles and different circles that explained celestial motions according to Ptolemaic astronomy. The interpretation of the completed horoscope was equally complex, requiring knowledge of the traditional associations between planets, zodiacal signs, and various aspects of human health and temperament. Mars was associated with fevers and inflammatory conditions, while Saturn governed melancholic disorders and chronic illnesses. The Moon influenced phlegmatic conditions and the ebb and flow of bodily fluids, while Venus affected reproductive health and diseases of the blood. The aspects or angular relationships between planets were considered particularly significant for medical diagnosis and prognosis. Favorable aspects like trinas and sextiles suggested that treatment would be successful and recovery likely, while unfavorable aspects like squares and oppositions indicated difficult cases that might resist conventional therapy. The physician would time his treatments to coincide with favorable planetary configurations, sometimes delaying urgent procedures until the stars were more propitiously aligned. The dominant theory of disease transmission during the medieval period centered on the concept of miasma, the belief that illness spread through corrupted or poisoned air that arose from rotting organic matter, stagnant water, or other sources of environmental contamination. This theory, while incorrect by modern standards, led physicians to pay careful attention to environmental factors that might contribute to disease and to recommend changes in living conditions as part of their therapeutic regimens. The physician would carefully examine not only the patient, but also the environment in which the illness had developed, noting any sources of foul odors, poor ventilation, or other conditions that might have contributed to the generation of corrupted air. He would recommend changes to the patient's living situation, such as moving to a different room with better air circulation, burning aromatic herbs to purify the atmosphere, or placing bowls of vinegar around the house to neutralize harmful vapors. Certain locations were considered particularly prone to miasmic contamination. Swamps, battlefields, and areas near tanneries or other malodorous industries were thought to generate especially dangerous forms of corrupted air that could cause epidemic disease. Physicians would advise patients to avoid such areas whenever possible, particularly during hot weather when putrefaction processes were thought to be most active. The theory of miasmic transmission also influenced architectural recommendations, with physicians advocating for proper ventilation, drainage, and sanitation as essential components of disease prevention. They would advise families to keep their homes clean and well-aired, to dispose of waste materials promptly and properly, and to avoid activities that might generate harmful vapors within the living space. Bloodletting formed the cornerstone of medieval medical treatment, prescribed for an enormous range of conditions, from simple headaches to complex mental disorders. The practice was based on the fundamental belief that most illnesses resulted from an excess of blood or corruption within the humoral system that could be corrected by draining away the problematic fluid. This seemingly simple procedure was actually governed by elaborate rules and protocols that physicians spent years learning to master. The decision to employ bloodletting required careful consideration of multiple factors, including the patient's age, gender, constitution, and astrological chart. Children and elderly patients were generally thought to tolerate blood loss poorly, while healthy adults in their prime years were considered ideal candidates for the procedure. Women were believed to require less bloodletting than men due to their naturally cooler, moister constitutions, though menstruation was thought to provide a natural form of bloodletting that helped maintain humoral balance. The physician had to choose from an array of specialized instruments, each designed for specific types of patients and procedures. The lancet was the most common bloodletting tool, a sharp double-edged blade designed to make clean incisions in superficial veins. These instruments were typically fitted with ivory or bone handles and kept in specially designed cases that protected their delicate edges from damage. Fleams were broader, heavier instruments used for deeper cuts or when larger quantities of blood needed to be removed quickly. These tools resembled small axes with wide blades that could open major vessels efficiently. The use of fleams required considerable skill and experience, as their size made it easy to cause serious injury if they were handled improperly. Cupping horns provided an alternative method for drawing blood from surface vessels without the need for deep incisions. These hollow animal horns were applied to the skin after small cuts had been made, creating suction that drew blood into the horn. The amount of blood removed could be controlled by adjusting the size and depth of the initial cuts and the degree of suction applied. The choice of bloodletting site was governed by complex theoretical considerations that correlated different body parts with specific organs and humoral systems. The cephalic vein in the arm was open for conditions affecting the head and brain, while the basilic vein was preferred for problems of the chest and lungs. The median vein was considered appropriate for general bloodletting when no specific organ system was primarily affected. Seasonal considerations played an important role in determining the optimal sites for bloodletting. Spring procedures typically targeted veins in the right arm, particularly the area between the thumb and forefinger, as this was thought to be most effective for draining the excess blood that accumulated during the season of growth and renewal. Autumn bloodletting favored the median vein of the left arm, which was believed to be most appropriate for addressing the melancholic conditions associated with the season of decline and preparation for winter. The timing of bloodletting procedures was governed by equally complex astrological calculations that took into account the phases of the moon, the positions of the planets, and the patient's individual horoscope. Certain lunar phases were considered particularly favorable for the practice, with the waning moon generally preferred for its supposed ability to draw corrupted humors out of the body. The full moon was often avoided, as it was thought to make patients more susceptible to excessive bleeding that might prove difficult to control. Planetary positions also influenced the timing of bloodletting procedures. Mars, the planet associated with iron and warfare, was considered favorable for bloodletting when properly aspected, while Saturn, linked to melancholy and chronic disease, might require special precautions. The physician would consult detailed astrological calendars that showed favorable and unfavorable days for medical procedures, sometimes delaying urgent treatments until the celestial conditions were more propitious. The actual bloodletting procedure required careful preparation and precise execution. The patient would be positioned comfortably, usually sitting upright with the arm to be treated supported on a cushioned surface. The physician would carefully palpate the chosen vein, marking the optimal incision site with a small dot of ink or charcoal. The skin would be cleaned with wine or vinegar to prevent contamination. and the bloodletting instrument would be examined to ensure that it was properly sharpened and cleaned. The incision itself had to be made with confidence and precision, cutting deeply enough to open the vein without causing unnecessary trauma to surrounding tissues. The physician would collect the flowing blood in specially designed bowls, carefully measuring the quantity removed and monitoring the patient for signs of excessive blood loss or adverse reactions. The amount of blood removed varied considerably depending on the patient's condition, constitution, and the purpose of the treatment. For minor ailments, a few ounces might suffice, while serious conditions could require the removal of a pint or more. The physician would stop the bleeding by applying pressure to the incision site, sometimes using styptic substances like alum or burned leather to help the blood coagulate. Leeches provided an alternative to surgical bloodletting that was particularly useful for delicate patients or sensitive areas of the body where surgical instruments might cause excessive trauma. These creatures were carefully maintained in containers filled with damp moss or linen, fed regularly on animal blood, and examined for signs of disease or parasitic infection before use. The application of leeches was a precise procedure that required considerable knowledge of their behavior and feeding patterns. The physician would select healthy, active leeches from his collection, examining them for signs of vigor and appetite. The area to be treated would be cleaned thoroughly, sometimes with warm water to encourage blood flow to the surface, and occasionally scarified lightly to help the leeches attach more readily. The leeches would be applied to the skin using various techniques designed to ensure proper attachment and feeding. Some physicians use small glass cups to confine the creatures to specific areas, while others relied on their natural feeding instincts to guide placement. The number of leeches used depended on the amount of blood to be removed and the size of the treatment area. Once attached, the leeches would be allowed to feed until they dropped off naturally, a process that could take anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour, depending on their size and hunger. The physician would monitor the patient carefully during this time, watching for signs of excessive blood loss, allergic reactions, or other complications. Some patients experienced nausea, dizziness, or fainting during leech treatment, requiring careful observation and supportive care. After the leeches had finished feeding, the bite wounds would continue to bleed for several hours due to anticoagulant substances in the creature's saliva. This prolonged bleeding was considered beneficial, as it was thought to continue the therapeutic drainage of corrupted humors even after the leeches had been removed. The wounds would be cleaned and bandaged, with careful instructions given about ongoing care and observation. The storage and maintenance of medicinal leeches required considerable expertise and attention to detail. The creatures had to be kept in clean, well-ventilated containers with appropriate moisture levels and temperature control. They were fed regularly on blood obtained from healthy animals, usually cattle or sheep, and their general health was monitored carefully to ensure their therapeutic effectiveness. The distinction between learned physicians and practical surgeons created a complex and often contentious hierarchy within medieval medical practice that reflected broader social attitudes about intellectual versus manual labor. University-trained physicians considered themselves scholars and gentlemen first, men of letters who diagnosed ailments and prescribed treatments, but rarely soiled their hands with the manual procedures that their theoretical knowledge might require. This artificial division between theory and practice often proved problematic for patients, who found themselves caught between physicians who could identify their conditions but not treat them directly, and surgeons who possessed the necessary manual skills but lacked the theoretical knowledge to understand the underlying causes of disease. The result was a fragmented system of care that could leave patients vulnerable to miscommunication, conflicting treatments, and delayed or inappropriate interventions. The social status differential between physicians and surgeons was reflected in their different paths to professional recognition. Physicians gained legitimacy through university education and mastery of classical texts, while surgeons learned their trade through apprenticeship and hands-on experience. This created two separate professional cultures with different values, different standards of practice, and often conflicting approaches to patient care. University-trained physicians enjoyed higher social status and commanded greater fees for their services, but their theoretical knowledge often proved inadequate when faced with practical medical emergencies. They could discourse learnedly about humoral theory and astrological influences, but when a patient arrived with a dislocated shoulder or a compound fracture, they were forced to defer to the practical skills of surgeons who had learned through years of hands-on experience. Barber surgeons occupied an ambiguous position within this hierarchy, combining the mundane tasks of hair cutting and shaving with increasingly sophisticated surgical procedures. The red and white striped pole that identified their shops symbolized their dual role, with red representing blood and white representing the bandages used in their medical work. These practitioners learned their trade through apprenticeship to established barber surgeons, spending years mastering the use of razors, lancets, and other sharp instruments. The guild system that governed surgical practice was separate from and often in competition with the university-based medical establishment. Surgical guilds established their own standards for training and practice, created their own systems of licensing and oversight, and jealously guarded their right to perform certain procedures. This parallel structure of professional organization often led to jurisdictional disputes and conflicts over which practitioners had the right to treat specific types of conditions. Common surgical procedures performed by barber surgeons included trepanation, the drilling of holes in the skull to relieve pressure or release what were believed to be evil spirits causing mental illness. This procedure was based on the observation that head injuries sometimes resulted in behavioral changes, leading to the conclusion that supernatural forces trapped within the skull could be released through carefully placed openings. The trepanation procedure required considerable skill and nerve, as the surgeon had to penetrate the skull without damaging the underlying brain tissue. Special trepanning tools were developed for this purpose, including circular saws that could cut through bone and elevating instruments that could lift out the removed sections of skull. The mortality rate for trepanation was extremely high, with many patients dying from infection, bleeding, or shock, rather than benefiting from the procedure. Arrow extraction represented another common surgical challenge, particularly in areas affected by warfare or hunting accidents. Barber surgeons developed specialized techniques for removing different types of projectiles, taking into account the design of arrowheads and the depth of penetration. Some arrows could be pulled out in the direction they had entered, while others required careful manipulation or even surgical enlargement of the wound to prevent further damage during removal. The surgical toolkit available to medieval practitioners was limited, but carefully crafted for specific purposes. Bone saws featured serrated edges designed to cut efficiently through both flesh and bone, while their handles were shaped to provide maximum leverage and control during amputations. These procedures were performed without effective anesthesia, relying instead on alcohol, opium preparations, or herbal mixtures that provided only partial pain relief. Cautery irons were essential tools for controlling bleeding and preventing infection. Though their use often caused severe burns and additional trauma, these instruments were heated in fire until they glowed red hot. then applied directly to wounds to seal blood vessels and destroy potentially infected tissue. The smell of burning flesh and the screams of patients made cauterization one of the most dreaded aspects of surgical treatment. Surgical needles were crafted from bone, silver, or steel, depending on the surgeon's financial resources and the importance of the procedure. These instruments were used with threads made from animal sinew, plant fibers, or precious metal wire to close wounds and hold tissues in position during healing. The choice of suture material often depended on the location of the wound and the expected duration of healing. Payment for surgical services was frequently negotiated in goods rather than coin, reflecting the uncertain economic status of barber surgeons and the variable outcomes of their interventions. A successful cataract removal might be rewarded with a side of beef, several bushels of grain, or a promise of future services. Failed operations rarely resulted in any compensation, leaving surgeons to bear not only the emotional burden of unsuccessful treatments, but also the financial consequences of their failures. The risk of being blamed for patient deaths created a constant source of anxiety for surgical practitioners who understood that their reputation and livelihood depended on maintaining acceptable success rates in an era when infection, shock, and other complications could kill even patients who survived their initial procedures. Some surgeons refused to treat cases they considered hopeless, while others specialized in particular types of operations where they had developed superior skills and experience. The medieval apothecary shop represented a fascinating intersection of commerce, craftsmanship, and primitive pharmaceutical science, serving as both laboratory and retail establishment for the preparation and distribution of medicinal substances. These establishments were typically located on busy commercial streets, their distinctive signs and aromatic emanations making them easily identifiable to potential customers seeking relief from various ailments. The interior of a typical apothecary shop was a carefully organized maze of shelves, cabinets, and storage areas designed to house hundreds of different medicinal substances in optimal conditions. Ceramic jars with tight-fitting lids protected sensitive herbs from moisture and contamination, while wooden boxes with multiple compartments allowed for the systematic organization of roots, seeds, and powdered preparations. Glass bottles of various sizes contained liquid extracts, distilled waters, and oil-based preparations that required protection from light and air. The air within these establishments was thick with a complex mixture of aromas that reflected the exotic nature of many medicinal substances. The sweet scent of dried rose petals mingled with the sharp fragrance of lavender, while the bitter odor of wormwood provided a harsh counterpoint to the pleasant smell of mint and chamomile. More exotic spices imported from distant lands contributed their own distinctive notes to this olfactory symphony, creating an atmosphere that was both welcoming and slightly mysterious. Foxglove occupied a place of honor among the apothecary stock, prized for its powerful effects on the heart and circulation, but feared for its narrow margin between therapeutic and toxic doses. The purple flowers of this plant were carefully harvested at the peak of their potency, dried in controlled conditions, and ground to a fine powder that had to be measured with extraordinary precision. Too little foxglove proved ineffective for treating heart conditions, while too much could stop the heart entirely, making its use a constant balance between benefit and risk. The preparation of foxglove required specialized knowledge and equipment that few apothecaries possessed. The dried leaves had to be ground in marble mortars using pestles of specific weights and shapes to ensure consistent particle size and even distribution of active principles. The resulting powder was then sifted through fine silk screens to remove any fragments that might cause irregular dosing, and finally stored in specially marked containers that warned of its dangerous nature. Valerian root represented another important component of the apothecary's inventory, valued for its calming effects on the nervous system and its ability to promote restful sleep. The collection of valerian required careful timing, as the roots were thought to be most potent when dug during the autumn months, when the plant was preparing for winter dormancy. The distinctive, earthy, somewhat unpleasant odor of valerian was considered a sign of its therapeutic potency, with stronger-smelling specimens commanding higher prices. The preparation of valerian involved a complex process of cleaning, drying, and grinding that could take several weeks to complete properly. The freshly dug roots were washed carefully to remove soil and debris, then chopped into small pieces and spread on wooden trays in well-ventilated areas protected from direct sunlight. The drying process had to be monitored constantly to prevent mold or spoilage, with the pieces turned regularly to ensure even moisture removal. Once properly dried, the valerian root was ground in small batches to prevent the volatile oils from dissipating due to heat generated by friction. The resulting powder was immediately transferred to airtight containers and stored in cool, dark locations where it could maintain its potency for extended periods. Some apothecaries preferred to prepare valerian extracts by soaking the powdered root in wine or spirits, creating liquid preparations that were easier to dose and administer to patients. Wormwood held a special place in the medieval pharmacopoeia due to its remarkable effectiveness against intestinal parasites, though its intensely bitter taste made it one of the most challenging medicines for patients to tolerate. The herb was typically harvested during the summer months when its bitter principles were most concentrated, then dried rapidly to preserve its therapeutic properties. The resulting material was so bitter that even small amounts could render food or drink virtually inedible. The preparation of wormwood required considerable skill in combining it with other substances that could mask its unpalatable taste without interfering with its medicinal properties. Honey was the most common sweetening agent used for this purpose, though the amounts required to make wormwood palatable often resulted in preparations that were prohibitively expensive for ordinary patients. Sweet wines, fruit syrups, and aromatic spices were also employed to create more tolerable formulations. The grinding of wormwood presented special challenges due to the plant's fibrous nature and tendency to form clumps rather than fine powder. Apothecaries developed specialized techniques for processing this difficult herb, often combining it with small amounts of other materials that would facilitate grinding and improve the consistency of the final product. The resulting preparations were typically stored in small containers and dispensed in carefully measured doses to prevent accidental overdosing. The preparation of compound medicines represented the highest level of pharmaceutical artistry, requiring not only extensive knowledge of individual herbs and their properties, but also understanding of how different substances interacted when combined. Electuaries, thick pastes made from powdered herbs bound together with honey or syrup, were particularly popular because they preserved the medicinal properties of delicate substances while making them easier to store and administer. The creation of a typical electuary was a multi-day process that demanded constant attention and precise timing. Each ingredient had to be prepared separately according to its own specific requirements before being combined in carefully predetermined proportions. Some herbs needed to be ground to fine powder, while others were better left in larger pieces to provide texture and facilitate gradual release of their active principles. The mixing process itself was a delicate operation that required considerable physical effort and technical skill. The apothecary would work methodically with his mortar and pestle, adding ingredients in a specific order that had been determined through centuries of trial and error. Each addition was followed by a predetermined number of grinding motions, with the operator pausing periodically to scrape down the sides of the mortar and ensure even distribution of the mixture. Many electuary recipes had been passed down through generations of apothecaries, copied carefully into leather-bound notebooks that represented the accumulated wisdom of centuries of pharmaceutical practice. These formulations followed the principles of Galenic medicine, seeking to balance hot and cold, wet and dry substances in combinations that would restore humoral equilibrium in sick patients. One particularly complex preparation used for treating fevers combined 12 different ingredients that had to be processed and combined according to a precise protocol. The recipe called for powdered willow bark to reduce heat, rose petals to provide cooling moisture, violet leaves for their anti-inflammatory properties, and cucumber seeds for their cold, moist qualities. These were combined with barley water, sugar of roses, syrup of pomegranates, distilled water of endive, essence of sorrel, ground pearls, prepared coral, and spirits of wine. Each ingredient in this complex preparation required individual attention and specific processing techniques. The willow bark had to be ground to a specific fineness that would allow rapid dissolution while avoiding the bitter taste that could result from overprocessing. The rose petals needed to be dried to precisely the right degree of moisture content, neither so dry that they would crumble to dust, nor so moist that they would promote spoilage of the finished product. The mineral components of such preparations presented their own unique challenges. Pearls had to be ground to an impalpably fine powder using special techniques that would break down their crystalline structure without generating excessive heat. Coral required similar treatment, with the additional consideration that its calcium carbonate content could interact chemically with acidic plant materials if not properly prepared. The final mixing of these ingredients was a delicate choreographed process that could take several hours to complete properly. The apothecary would begin with the heaviest, least soluble components, gradually adding lighter materials while maintaining constant motion to prevent settling or separation. The addition of liquid ingredients required particular care to avoid creating lumps or inconsistent texture in the finished product. Quality control represented a constant concern for medieval apothecaries who understood that their reputation and livelihood depended on maintaining consistent standards in an era when analytical testing was impossible and product contamination could prove fatal. The experienced practitioner learned to recognize high-quality materials through careful sensory evaluation, developing expertise that could mean the difference between healing and harm. Visual inspection formed the first line of quality assessment, with experienced apothecaries learning to identify the subtle color variations that indicated proper drying, optimal harvest timing, and freedom from contamination. Fresh herbs should display characteristic colors that indicated recent harvest and proper storage, while any browning, discoloration, or unusual spotting might suggest spoilage or adulteration. Aromatic evaluation provided additional information about the quality and potency of medicinal materials. Each herb possessed a distinctive scent profile that experienced practitioners could use to assess freshness, identify substitutions, and detect contamination with foreign substances. The intensity of aromatic compounds often correlated with therapeutic potency, making olfactory assessment a valuable tool for quality evaluation. Tactile examination revealed information about texture, moisture content, and structural integrity that could not be obtained through visual or aromatic inspection alone. Properly dried herbs should feel crisp and brittle, breaking cleanly when bent or twisted, Any flexibility or sponginess might indicate inadequate drying that could lead to spoilage, while excessive brittleness might suggest overdrying that had degraded the active principles. The problem of adulterated or substituted ingredients represented a constant threat to both patient safety and professional reputation. Unscrupulous suppliers might substitute cheaper herbs for expensive ones, mix inferior materials with high-quality substances, or sell products that had been stored improperly and lost their therapeutic properties. The detection of such fraud required considerable experience and knowledge of the subtle characteristics that distinguished authentic materials from counterfeits. Economic pressures often tempted apothecaries to accept questionable materials when supplies of preferred substances were scarce or prohibitively expensive. The challenge was to balance the need to maintain adequate inventory with the responsibility to provide effective, safe medications to patients who depended on their expertise and integrity. The arrival of plague in 1348 marked one of the darkest and most devastating chapters in medieval medical history, exposing with brutal clarity the complete inadequacy of contemporary medical theory and practice when confronted with genuine epidemic disease. The Black Death swept across Europe with unprecedented speed and lethality, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population and devastating entire communities within weeks of its first appearance. The plague arrived without warning and defied all attempts at explanation or control using the medical knowledge of the time. Physicians trained in humoral theory found their elaborate diagnostic techniques utterly useless when faced with a disease that killed healthy adults within days and showed no respect for social status, personal virtue, or medical intervention. The carefully calculated bloodletting procedures that formed the cornerstone of medieval therapeutics proved not only ineffective, but often hastened the deaths of patients already weakened by disease. Medical practitioners found themselves completely helpless against the plague's advance, their years of education and experience providing no protection against a pathogen they could neither understand nor combat. The elaborate astrological calculations that guided their treatment decisions proved meaningless when entire populations succumbed regardless of their horoscopes or humoral constitutions. The uroscopy techniques that had served as reliable diagnostic tools for generations became irrelevant when patients died before proper examinations could be completed. The mortality rate among physicians was particularly devastating, as their close contact with infected patients made them extremely vulnerable to contagion. Entire medical communities were wiped out within months, taking with them centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience that could never be recovered. The University of Paris lost most of its medical faculty during the initial outbreak, while smaller towns and rural communities found themselves completely without trained medical practitioners. Those physicians who remained in plague-stricken areas often died alongside their patients, victims of a disease they had dedicated their lives to fighting, but could neither prevent nor cure. Others fled from affected regions in large numbers, abandoning their patients and their professional obligations in desperate attempts to preserve their own lives. This mass exodus of medical practitioners left suffering populations without even the limited help that medieval medicine could provide. The few physicians who remained to treat plague victims often resorted to increasingly desperate and irrational treatments as conventional therapies proved useless. Some prescribed massive bloodletting procedures that further weakened already dying patients, while others recommended exotic compounds containing gold, precious stones, and rare spices that offered no therapeutic benefit, but commanded enormous fees from desperate families. Contemporary accounts describe physicians wearing elaborate protective equipment, including the iconic beaked masks that have become symbols of plague doctors in popular imagination. These masks were filled with aromatic herbs and spices that were believed to filter or neutralize the corrupted air thought to carry the disease. However, such equipment was actually quite rare and expensive, used primarily by physicians employed by municipal governments to treat the poor and indigent. The beak-shaped masks were designed to hold substantial quantities of aromatic substances that would theoretically protect the wearer from miasmic infection. Common materials used for this purpose included lavender, rosemary, thyme, cloves, cinnamon, and other fragrant herbs that were believed to possess protective properties. The masks also featured glass eye pieces and leather straps that created an enclosed environment intended to isolate the physician from contaminated air. Most practicing physicians had neither the resources nor the inclination to invest in such elaborate protective equipment, relying instead on simpler measures like carrying aromatic herbs in their clothing or burning protective substances in their homes and offices. Many continued to see patients using their traditional methods and equipment, trusting in divine protection or fatalistic acceptance of their professional duties. Quarantine measures represented one of the few interventions that showed any effectiveness against plague transmission, though these were implemented haphazardly and often too late to prevent widespread community infection. The practice of quarantine had been developed in response to earlier epidemics, with the 40-day isolation period that gave the practice its name being derived from religious rather than medical considerations. Ships arriving from infected ports were required to wait at anchor for 40 days before being allowed to dock and unload their cargo, a practice that sometimes succeeded in preventing the introduction of plague into previously unaffected communities. However, the implementation of maritime quarantine was inconsistent and often undermined by economic pressures that encouraged merchants and port officials to ignore or circumvent the regulations. Terrestrial quarantine proved even more difficult to enforce as infected individuals could travel considerable distances before developing obvious symptoms, spreading the disease to new communities along their routes. Some cities attempted to establish cordon sanitaires around infected areas, but these were rarely effective due to the porous nature of medieval borders and the difficulty of controlling population movements. Pest houses were established outside many towns and cities to isolate suspected plague cases, but these facilities often became death traps where healthy individuals contracted the disease from infected patients. The overcrowded, unsanitary conditions in most pest houses actually facilitated disease transmission rather than preventing it, while the quality of care provided was often minimal due to the reluctance of medical practitioners to work in such dangerous environments. Religious processions of flagellants became common sights during plague outbreaks, with groups of penitents moving from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in the belief that their suffering might appease divine wrath and end the pestilence. These processions often passed directly in front of physicians' houses, serving as grim reminders of the limits of medical knowledge and the power of popular religious fervor in times of crisis. The flagellant movement represented a form of mass hysteria that reflected the complete breakdown of confidence in secular authority and medical expertise that accompanied the plague's devastation. Participants believed that the epidemic represented divine punishment for humanity's sins, and that only extreme acts of penance could persuade God to end the suffering. The processions themselves may have actually contributed to the spread of plague by bringing together large crowds of people from different communities and encouraging close physical contact among participants. The self-inflicted wounds that characterized flagellant practice also created opportunities for secondary infections that could further weaken participants' resistance to plague and other diseases. Medical authorities were generally powerless to discourage flagellant activities, as their own treatments had proved so conspicuously ineffective that they had little credibility with desperate populations seeking any possible relief from the epidemic. Some physicians actually participated in or endorsed flagellant processions, viewing them as potentially beneficial supplements to conventional medical treatment. The long-term impact of the Black Death on medieval medical practice was profound and lasting, fundamentally undermining confidence in traditional authorities and creating opportunities for new approaches to understanding health and disease. The obvious failure of university-trained physicians to provide effective treatment opened the door for alternative healers, folk practitioners, and religious authorities who claimed superior knowledge or divine intervention. The massive mortality among medical practitioners created severe shortages of trained physicians that persisted for generations after the initial epidemic. Medical schools struggled to rebuild their faculties and student populations, while communities that had lost their local physicians often remained without professional medical care for years or decades. The psychological trauma of the plague experience also had lasting effects on medical practice, creating a more fatalistic and pessimistic approach to treatment that persisted long after the epidemic had ended. Many physicians who survived the plague became more cautious and conservative in their practice, reluctant to attempt innovative treatments or make optimistic prognoses for seriously ill patients. The instruments carried by medieval physicians represented not only significant financial investments, but also powerful symbols of professional status and competence that helped establish credibility with patients and colleagues. Each piece was carefully selected for its specific purposes and maintained with meticulous attention to detail, as the quality and condition of a physician's equipment often influenced both patient confidence and professional reputation within the medical community. The craftsmanship involved in creating medical instruments was of the highest quality available in medieval society, with specialized artisans developing techniques and designs specifically for medical applications. These craftsmen understood that physicians' tools had to meet exacting standards for sharpness, durability, and precision that far exceeded the requirements of ordinary implements used for domestic or commercial purposes. Scalpels represented the most basic and essential surgical instruments designed for making precise incisions in human tissue with minimal trauma and optimal healing characteristics. The blades were forged from the finest steel available, using techniques that produced edges capable of maintaining their sharpness through repeated use while resisting corrosion and contamination. Different blade shapes were developed for specific purposes, with straight edges preferred for clean incisions through skin and muscle, while curved blades were better suited for delicate work around joints and sensitive anatomical structures. The handles of surgical scalpels were typically crafted from ivory, bone, or precious metals, chosen not only for their aesthetic appeal but also for their practical advantages in medical applications. Ivory handles provided excellent grip characteristics even when wet with blood or other bodily fluids, while their smooth surfaces could be cleaned easily and thoroughly between uses. The natural antimicrobial properties of some materials also helped reduce the risk of infection transmission from one patient to another. The fitting of blades to handles required considerable skill and precision, as any looseness or instability could prove dangerous during surgical procedures. Master craftsmen developed specialized techniques for creating secure permanent attachments that would withstand the stresses of surgical use while allowing for easy cleaning and maintenance of both components. Brass syringes were essential tools for administering enemas and other liquid medications, representing sophisticated examples of medieval precision engineering that required careful manufacturing and constant maintenance to function properly. These instruments consisted of multiple components that had to be machined to precise tolerances and assembled with expert craftsmanship to ensure reliable operation under demanding conditions. The brass alloy used for these syringes was specifically chosen for its resistance to corrosion and its antimicrobial properties, which help prevent contamination of the medications being administered. The manufacturing process required considerable skill in working with metals, as the cylindrical chambers and plunger mechanisms had to be fabricated with precision that approached the limits of medieval metalworking technology. The maintenance of brass syringes was a time-consuming but essential aspect of professional medical practice, as any buildup of residue or corrosion could contaminate future treatments and potentially harm patients. Physicians developed elaborate cleaning protocols that involved complete disassembly of the instruments after each use, followed by thorough cleaning with wine, vinegar, or other substances believed to have antiseptic properties. The reassembly of cleaned syringes required careful attention to the proper alignment and lubrication of moving parts, as any binding or irregularity in operation could interfere with accurate dosing or cause painful administration procedures. Many physicians maintained multiple syringes in their collections, allowing them to rotate instruments through cleaning cycles while ensuring that functional equipment was always available for patient care. Silver uroscopy flasks represented perhaps the most prestigious and expensive items in the physician's instrumental armamentarium, serving both practical diagnostic purposes and symbolic functions that demonstrated the practitioner's commitment to his profession and his position within the medical hierarchy. These beautiful vessels were often engraved with elaborate decorative motifs, personal inscriptions, or coats of arms that identified their owners and proclaimed their professional achievements. The choice of silver for these diagnostic instruments was based on both practical and theoretical considerations that reflected medieval understanding of the relationships between metals, health, and disease. Silver's natural antimicrobial properties were well known to medieval physicians, who observed that liquids stored in silver containers remained fresh longer than those kept in vessels made from other materials. The clarity and brilliance of silver also provided practical advantages for uroscopic diagnosis, as the metal's reflective properties enhanced the visibility of subtle color variations and other characteristics that might be missed when using flasks made from less reflective materials. The smooth, non-porous surface of silver also prevented the absorption of odors or staining that could interfere with accurate assessment of subsequent urine samples. The craftsmanship involved in creating silver uroscopy flasks required the services of master silversmiths who possessed both artistic skill and technical knowledge of medical requirements. The distinctive bulbous shape of these vessels was not merely decorative, but served important functional purposes in facilitating proper observation of urine samples under various lighting conditions. The care and maintenance of medical instruments was a time-consuming but absolutely essential aspect of professional practice that occupied significant portions of the physician's daily routine. The development of proper maintenance protocols required understanding of metallurgy, chemistry, and the properties of various cleaning agents that were available in the medieval period. Metal instruments required regular treatment with oils and other protective substances to prevent rust and corrosion that could interfere with their function or contaminate patient treatments. Different types of steel and other alloys required specific maintenance approaches, with physicians learning to recognize the optimal treatments for each material in their collections. The preparation and application of protective oils was itself a complex process that required knowledge of which substances would provide effective protection without interfering with the instrument's medical functions. Some oils could become rancid or develop unpleasant odors that might affect patient comfort, while others might react chemically with medicinal substances or bodily fluids encountered during treatment procedures. Parchment cases that protected delicate instruments during transport and storage required their own specialized care regimens to prevent deterioration from moisture, insects, or other environmental hazards. These cases were often lined with soft materials that would cushion instruments against shock while absorbing any residual moisture that might promote corrosion or contamination. The weight of a fully equipped medical bag could be considerable, making house calls a physically demanding aspect of practice that required both stamina and careful organization to manage effectively. Physicians had to balance the need to carry comprehensive equipment against the practical limitations imposed by the weight and bulk of their instruments and supplies. The organization of medical equipment followed careful logic developed through years of experience, with frequently used items placed in easily accessible pockets, while more specialized tools were stored in padded compartments that protected them from damage during transport. Many physicians developed highly personal systems for organizing their equipment, memorizing the location of each item so that they could be retrieved quickly, even in dim lighting or emergency situations. House calls formed the backbone of medieval medical practice, as most patients lacked both the means and the inclination to visit physicians in their offices or clinics. These journeys often took practitioners far from the safety and comfort of their homes, requiring them to navigate treacherous urban environments by lantern light while carrying valuable instruments and medicines that made them attractive targets for robbery and violence. The medieval urban environment presented numerous hazards for the traveling physician that extended far beyond the obvious risks of crime and accident. Streets were typically narrow, unpaved, and frequently blocked by refuse, market stalls, construction materials, or other obstacles that could impede progress or cause injury in darkness. During rainy seasons, these thoroughfares became treacherous quagmires of mud and filth that could trap horses, overturn carts, or cause pedestrians to lose their footing and fall into contaminated water. The complete absence of street lighting meant that night calls required physicians to provide their own illumination, usually in the form of lanterns or torches that announced their presence to anyone who might wish them harm. The flickering, unreliable light provided by these devices made navigation difficult and dangerous, while the need to maintain the flame added another layer of complexity to an already challenging journey. The valuable contents of the physician's bag made him an especially attractive target for criminals who understood that medical equipment and medicines could be sold for substantial sums in underground markets. Surgical instruments crafted from precious metals commanded high prices, while exotic medicines and preparations could be worth more than their weight in gold to desperate patients or unscrupulous competitors. Negotiating fees with patients and their families often proved to be the most challenging and delicate aspect of house calls, particularly when treating individuals of uncertain financial means or questionable ability to pay for services rendered. Medieval physicians had to develop considerable diplomatic skills to navigate these discussions while maintaining their professional dignity and ensuring adequate compensation for their services. The absence of standardized fee schedules meant that every financial arrangement had to be negotiated individually, taking into account the patient's condition, the complexity of treatment required, the family's economic circumstances, and the likelihood of successful outcomes. Physicians learned to be flexible in their payment arrangements, accepting various forms of compensation that might include livestock, agricultural products, manufactured goods, or promises of future services. Chickens were among the most common forms of non-monetary payment as they provided immediate value while being easily transportable and convertible to cash if necessary. Grain payments were also popular, particularly during harvest seasons when agricultural products were abundant and patients' cash reserves might be limited. Cloth, tools, and other manufactured goods could serve as acceptable compensation, though their value had to be carefully assessed to ensure fair exchange. Sometimes physicians would agree to provide treatment in exchange for future considerations or services, though collecting on such agreements could prove difficult or impossible if patients' circumstances changed or if they simply chose to ignore their obligations. The lack of effective legal remedies for unpaid medical bills meant that physicians often had to write off substantial amounts of uncollected fees, making their financial planning difficult and uncertain. The relationship between university-trained physicians and traditional healers created constant tension and competition within medieval medical practice, reflecting broader social conflicts between formal education and practical experience, male and female roles, and elite versus popular culture. These conflicts often worked to the disadvantage of patients, who found themselves caught between competing systems of care that might offer contradictory diagnoses and incompatible treatments. Wise women, herbalists, and midwives possessed practical knowledge gained through generations of hands-on experience, often proving more effective than learned physicians in treating common ailments and providing practical care for routine health problems. Their intimate knowledge of local plants, traditional remedies, and time-tested treatments gave them significant advantages in many clinical situations, while their lower fees made their services accessible to patients who could not afford university-trained physicians. However, the lack of formal education and official licensing made these traditional practitioners vulnerable to charges of practicing medicine without proper authority, particularly when their treatments failed or when they came into conflict with established physicians seeking to protect their professional territories. The legal and social mechanisms that protected licensed physicians were generally unavailable to traditional healers, leaving them exposed to prosecution fines and other forms of persecution. Midwives presented a particular challenge to male physicians, as they dominated the field of obstetric care and possessed intimate knowledge of women's health issues that male practitioners could never hope to match due to social restrictions on their access to female patients. The Church generally supported midwifery as a necessary female occupation that served important social functions, but university-trained physicians increasingly sought to establish their authority over all aspects of medical practice, including childbirth and women's health. The resulting conflicts often played out in legal and regulatory arenas, with physicians seeking to limit the scope of practice allowed to traditional healers while midwives and other practitioners fought to maintain their traditional roles and prerogatives. These disputes could become quite bitter and personal, involving accusations of incompetence, fraud, or even witchcraft against practitioners who threatened established interests. The physician's distinctive professional attire served multiple purposes that went far beyond simple identification or fashion, incorporating both practical elements designed to provide protection against disease and symbolic components that communicated social status and professional authority. The development of medical dress codes reflected medieval understanding of disease transmission, as well as the importance of maintaining professional dignity and patient confidence. The typical physician's robe was long and flowing, made from dark wool or velvet that would not show stains easily, while providing warmth during long winter journeys between patients' homes. The dark colors favored by medical practitioners served practical purposes, as they concealed the blood and other bodily fluids that inevitably accumulated during medical procedures, while also conveying the serious scholarly nature of medical practice. The fabric itself was often treated with aromatic herbs and protective substances that were believed to create a barrier against the miasmic influences thought to cause disease. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and other fragrant herbs were sewn into the lining of medical robes or used to create sachets that were carried in hidden pockets. These aromatic defenses were thought to neutralize corrupted air and protect the physician from contagion during his interactions with sick patients. The design of the physician's cloak incorporated several practical features that facilitated medical practice while maintaining professional appearance. The hood could be pulled up over the head when entering areas of suspected contamination, providing additional protection for the face and hair. Wide sleeves allowed for easy access to instruments and medicines carried in interior pockets, while also accommodating the bulky clothing worn underneath during cold weather. Some physicians wore special gloves that had been treated with protective oils and herbal preparations, though these were expensive accessories that were not universally adopted. The gloves were typically made from soft leather that allowed for adequate dexterity during examinations and procedures, while providing a barrier between the physician's skin and potentially contaminated patients or materials. The symbolic aspects of medical dress were equally important, as patients needed to be able to identify qualified physicians and distinguish them from the various charlatans and quacks who might attempt to exploit their desperation. The quality of a physician's robes, the richness of their materials, and the elegance of their construction all served to communicate the practitioner's professional status and success. Social prestige and constant suspicion created a complex and often contradictory environment for medieval physicians, who found themselves simultaneously revered as learned scholars and suspected as potential charlatans, heretics, or incompetents. Their university education and mastery of classical texts placed them among the intellectual elite of medieval society, while their practical failures and the mysterious nature of their treatments made them objects of popular skepticism and sometimes open hostility. The contradiction between theoretical knowledge and practical results created particular challenges for physicians who were expected to possess nearly divine insight into the causes and cures of disease while working with tools and techniques that were often demonstrably ineffective. Patients and their families might initially approach physicians with great respect and high expectations, only to become angry and accusatory when treatments failed to produce the promised results. Guild oversight provided both professional support and bureaucratic burden for practicing physicians, creating systems of mutual accountability that could protect practitioners from unjust accusations, while also imposing restrictions on innovative or experimental approaches to treatment. Medical guilds established standards for training, licensing, and practice, but they also imposed fines and other penalties for what they deemed excessive daring or dangerous deviation from accepted procedures. The challenge of defining excessive daring in medical practice created ongoing tensions within the profession, as physicians had to balance the need for innovation and improvement against the risk of being censured by their colleagues for attempting unproven treatments. A practitioner who tried innovative approaches risked professional punishment even if his treatments proved successful, while one who adhered too strictly to traditional methods might be criticized for lack of initiative or failure to keep current with developments in medical knowledge. The complex relationship between faith and emerging scientific knowledge created profound spiritual stress for many medieval physicians who found themselves caught between the Church's teachings about divine causation of illness and their own increasingly sophisticated observations about natural causes and remedies. The official doctrine held that disease was often a manifestation of God's will, either as punishment for sin or as a test of faith, which made medical intervention potentially problematic from a theological perspective. Confessors sometimes prescribed penance for physicians whose treatments failed, suggesting that the lack of success resulted from spiritual inadequacy or insufficient faith rather than limitations in medical knowledge or technique. This created enormous psychological pressure on practitioners who had to maintain their confidence in medical methods while accepting responsibility for outcomes that might be completely beyond their control. The requirement to balance medical practice with religious observance added additional layers of complexity to an already demanding profession. Physicians were expected to attend regular religious services, participate in church activities, and demonstrate their piety through charitable work and donations, all while maintaining busy medical practices that required enormous amounts of time and energy. Some physicians found themselves questioned by religious authorities about the orthodoxy of their medical theories or the appropriateness of their treatments, particularly when they relied heavily on texts translated from Arabic sources or when they attempted to explain disease processes in purely naturalistic terms. The line between acceptable medical practice and potentially heretical natural philosophy was often unclear, leaving practitioners vulnerable to accusations of impiety, or worse. Professional burnout was an increasingly common phenomenon among medieval physicians, who worked extraordinarily long hours under difficult conditions while facing constant criticism and suspicion from patients, colleagues, and religious authorities. The combination of physical demands, intellectual challenges, and social pressures created a profession that few could sustain for an entire career without significant personal cost in terms of health, family relationships, and emotional well-being. The daily routine of a successful medieval physician was exhausting and relentless, beginning before dawn and often extending well into the night. The physical demands of the profession were considerable, requiring practitioners to maintain concentration and manual dexterity despite long hours spent in uncomfortable positions, poor lighting conditions, and stressful circumstances where life and death decisions had to be made quickly and accurately. The intellectual demands were equally challenging, as physicians had to master and remember vast amounts of theoretical knowledge while constantly updating their understanding based on new cases, changing theories, and evolving treatment protocols. The need to calculate astrological influences, interpret complex diagnostic signs, and compound precise medications required mental skills that few professions demanded to such an extent. The emotional toll of medical practice was perhaps the most difficult aspect to bear, as physicians witnessed enormous amounts of human suffering while often being powerless to provide effective relief. The high mortality rates associated with many conditions meant that practitioners spent much of their time caring for patients who would ultimately die despite their best efforts, creating a constant source of professional frustration and personal grief. To illustrate the daily reality of medieval medical practice, we might follow Master Hugo through a typical day in his career as a respected physician in a prosperous medieval town. Hugo's routine exemplified both the dedication and the challenges that characterized the profession during this era, demonstrating the enormous personal costs that accompanied whatever rewards the practice of medicine might offer. Hugo's day began well before dawn, as was customary for medieval physicians who believed that the pre-dawn hours were particularly important for spiritual preparation and mental clarity. Rising from his straw mattress in the cold darkness of his unheated chamber, he would immediately begin his morning prayers, spending at least 30 minutes in meditation and supplication before attending to any worldly concerns. The stone floor beneath his knees during prayer served as a constant reminder of his mortal limitations and his dependence upon divine grace for success in his medical practice. The cold air in his chamber helped maintain his alertness during these devotional exercises, while the silence of the early morning hours provided an opportunity for contemplation and spiritual preparation for the challenges that lay ahead. After completing his prayers, Hugo would light a single candle from the carefully banked embers of his hearth fire, using this modest illumination to review his notes from the previous day and plan his activities for the hours ahead. He maintained detailed records of all his patients' conditions and treatments, referring to these notes constantly to track progress and adjust therapeutic approaches as needed. His first patients would often arrive before he had time to break his fast, having traveled through the night to reach his chambers when their conditions worsened or when family members became frightened about the progression of illness. These early morning consultations typically involved the most desperate cases, patients whose symptoms had deteriorated during the dark hours when medical help was unavailable. Hugo would examine each early patient carefully by candlelight, his movements deliberate and methodical despite the urgency conveyed by worried relatives who might have walked for hours through dangerous streets to reach his door. The flickering light made diagnostic procedures more difficult, but his years of experience had taught him to compensate for poor lighting conditions through enhanced use of his other senses. The morning hours were traditionally devoted to uroscopy examinations, as the first urine of the day was considered most valuable for diagnostic purposes. Hugo would spend considerable time studying each sample, comparing colors and consistencies to the gradations shown on his diagnostic wheels, while taking notes about his observations and their implications for treatment decisions. Each uroscopic examination required careful attention to multiple factors beyond simple color assessment. Hugo would note the clarity or cloudiness of samples, the presence of sediment or unusual particles, and any distinctive odors that might provide clues about underlying conditions. He would often examine the same sample multiple times under different lighting conditions to ensure accurate assessment. The calculation of astrological influences formed another important component of Hugo's morning routine, as he believed that planetary positions at the time of illness onset could provide crucial information about prognosis and optimal treatment timing. He would consult his astronomical tables and calculation instruments, working through complex mathematical procedures to determine the positions of celestial bodies and their potential effects on his patient's conditions. These astrological calculations were time-consuming and required considerable mathematical skill, but Hugo considered them essential for proper medical practice. He would note unfavorable planetary aspects that might complicate treatment, while identifying favorable configurations that could be exploited to enhance therapeutic effectiveness. Midday brought Hugo's weekly obligation to deliver a lecture at the local medical guild hall, where he was required to present interesting cases and discuss theoretical questions with his colleagues. These sessions served both educational and regulatory purposes, allowing the guild to monitor individual practitioners while facilitating the exchange of knowledge and experience throughout the medical community. The guild lectures were often contentious affairs, as physicians defended their diagnostic methods and treatment choices against criticism from colleagues who might have different theoretical orientations or practical experiences. Hugo had to prepare his presentations carefully, anticipating potential objections and developing compelling arguments to support his clinical decisions. These professional gatherings also provided opportunities for networking and collaboration, as physicians might refer difficult cases to colleagues with special expertise or seek consultation about challenging diagnostic problems. However, they could also become venues for professional jealousy and competition, particularly when successful practitioners were perceived as threatening the economic interests of their colleagues. The afternoon hours were typically reserved for house calls, which required Hugo to load his leather satchel with all the instruments and medicines he might need during his rounds through the town. The weight of the fully equipped bag placed considerable strain on his shoulders and back, particularly during long walking tours that might cover several miles of difficult terrain. Hugo's house call schedule was carefully planned to maximize efficiency while ensuring that the most seriously ill patients received priority attention. He would group visits by geographic location when possible, though emergency calls often disrupted his planned itinerary and forced him to make difficult decisions about which patients to see first. Each house call presented unique challenges and opportunities as Hugo had to adapt his diagnostic and treatment approaches to widely varying environmental conditions, family dynamics, and economic circumstances. Wealthy patients might provide comfortable, well-lit rooms for examination, while poor families might offer only cramped, dirty spaces that made proper medical care extremely difficult. The social aspects of house calls were often as challenging as the medical components, as Hugo had to navigate complex family relationships, financial negotiations, and community politics while maintaining his focus on patient care. Some families were cooperative and grateful, while others were suspicious, demanding, or openly hostile to medical intervention. Evening brought one of Hugo's most demanding responsibilities, the occasional autopsy performed on the body of a condemned criminal. These procedures were rare and carefully regulated by church authorities, who permitted dissection only under specific circumstances and with strict limitations on what could be examined and how the findings could be interpreted. Hugo would work by torchlight in a cold stone chamber, his hands trembling as much from apprehension as from the chill air that surrounded him during these procedures. The anatomical knowledge gained from these infrequent dissections was precious but limited, providing only occasional glimpses into the internal structure of the human body that classical texts described in often contradictory terms. The dissection process itself was carefully prescribed by tradition and regulation, with specific procedures that had to be followed exactly to avoid accusations of impropriety or sacrilege. Hugo would make careful notes about his observations, comparing what he found with the descriptions provided in ancient texts and trying to reconcile any discrepancies with established theoretical frameworks. The psychological impact of performing autopsies was considerable, as Hugo had to overcome natural revulsion and religious scruples while maintaining the scientific objectivity necessary for useful observation. The knowledge that he was violating social taboos and potentially endangering his soul added emotional stress to what was already a physically and intellectually demanding procedure. The final hours of Hugo's day were spent in his private study, copying passages from classical medical texts by the flickering light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls around him. This scholarly work was considered essential for maintaining his intellectual credentials and staying current with developments in medical theory and natural philosophy. The process of copying texts was laborious and time-consuming, requiring precise attention to detail and perfect penmanship that would not deteriorate even during long hours of continuous work. Hugo would copy not only medical text, but also works on astronomy, natural philosophy, and theology that were considered relevant to medical practice. The physical demands of manuscript copying were considerable, as Hugo had to maintain proper posture and hand position for hours at a time while working in dim light that strained his eyes and made accurate work increasingly difficult as the evening progressed. His fingers would become stiff and cramped from gripping the pen, while his back and neck ached from bending over the writing surface. The intellectual engagement required for copying was more complex than simple transcription, as Hugo had to understand the meaning of what he was copying in order to recognize and correct errors that might appear in his source materials. He would often pause to consider difficult passages, consulting other texts or his own experience to resolve ambiguities or contradictions. The scratch of Hugo's pen on parchment provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the settling sounds of his house as the day's warmth dissipated into the cold night air. This sound became the constant soundtrack of his evening hours, a reminder of the endless nature of medical learning and the vast amounts of knowledge that remained to be mastered. Sleep came grudgingly to Hugo, his mind continuing to puzzle over difficult cases and theoretical questions long after his body had settled into his straw mattress. The weight of responsibility for his patient's welfare pressed down upon him like a physical burden, made heavier by his constant awareness of the limitations of contemporary medical knowledge and his own fallible human nature. The cold stone walls of Hugo's bedroom seemed to echo with the voices of patients he had been unable to help, while the darkness brought vivid memories of procedures that had failed and treatments that had caused more harm than good. These nocturnal reflections were an inescapable part of medical practice, as physicians carried the emotional burden of their professional failures along with pride in their successes. Hugo's dreams were often filled with images of astrological charts, urine samples, and anatomical diagrams that blended together in surreal combinations that reflected the complex theoretical frameworks that governed his daily practice. Sometimes he would wake with solutions to diagnostic problems that had puzzled him during his waking hours, though more often his sleep brought only temporary escape from the relentless demands of his profession. The cycle would begin again before dawn, as Hugo rose to face another day of challenges that would test his knowledge, skill, and endurance to their limits. The routine never varied significantly, though the specific problems and patients changed constantly, creating a professional life that was simultaneously predictable and completely unpredictable. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the labyrinthine world of medieval medicine, we can appreciate the tremendous dedication and perseverance required of those who chose to pursue the healing arts in an age of uncertainty, superstition, and limited knowledge. These practitioners faced challenges that would daunt even the most determined modern physician, working with inadequate tools and incomplete understanding while bearing enormous responsibility for their patients' welfare and their own professional survival. The medieval physician's life was one of constant study and perpetual uncertainty, where every diagnosis might prove wrong and every treatment might cause more harm than good. Yet they persevered through years of education, apprenticeship, and practice, driven by genuine desire to heal and help their fellow human beings, despite the overwhelming limitations imposed by their historical circumstances and the primitive state of medical knowledge. Their struggles with endless bureaucracy, their wrestling with complex theoretical systems that bore little relationship to clinical reality, and their dedication to learning in an age when knowledge was scarce and expensive deserve our admiration and respect. They laid the foundations upon which all subsequent medical progress was built, even though their specific methods and theories have long since been abandoned. Consider for a moment the remarkable comfort and security of your own warm bed, the extraordinary blessing of living in an age when effective treatments exist for most common ailments, and the incredible luxury of having access to medical knowledge that has been accumulated and refined over centuries of scientific progress. The shivering medieval physician, hunched over his manuscripts by candlelight in an unheated chamber, could scarcely have imagined the medical miracles that we now take for granted. Take a deep breath now and let gratitude fill your mind as sleep approaches with the gentle inevitability of nightfall. Feel the softness of your pillow beneath your head, the warmth of your blanket surrounding your body, and the profound peace that comes from knowing that effective medical help is readily available should you ever need it. Let the struggles of Master Hugo and his dedicated colleagues fade gently into the distant past where they belong, carrying with them your own worries and concerns of the present day. Their battles with ignorance and disease have long since ended. Their sufferings have been transformed into wisdom, and their failures have been redeemed by the medical progress that followed in their wake. The candle has finally burned low, the manuscript pages have been turned for the last time, and the long day's work is finally done. Rest now in perfect security, knowing that morning will bring fresh hope and new possibilities, unencumbered by the medical nightmares of ages past. Sleep well, dear listener, and let the gentle rhythm of history's turning pages carry you softly into the most peaceful of dreams.